Every horror movie has a truth, and behind Jigsaw, the truth is more disturbing because it doesn't involve monsters, curses, or supernatural forces. It involves an ordinary man, a man who believed he understood life better than anyone else. John Kramer, engineer, husband, visionary. Before becoming the architect of deadly games, he was just an exemplary citizen, until the world began to collapse around him. John had always been obsessed with order. As a civil engineer, he saw beauty in stable structures, in exact calculations, in everything that could be predicted. But that precision hid something deeper. He believed that every human life also had a structure, and that when someone wasted their own existence, they broke something in the world's balance. It was only a personal philosophy, until it became a weapon. His marriage to Jill Tuck seemed solid. She ran a recovery clinic, and John admired the idea of giving people a second chance. But the heavy environment, the violence of the streets, and the constant contact with drug-dependent patients began to affect their relationship. Still, John believed he could fix everything. That was how he lived, analyzing problems as if they were structural projects. Then came the first major blow. During a robbery at the clinic, Jill, pregnant, was pushed against a metal door. The trauma caused her to lose the baby. Something inside John shattered that day. Not only the marriage, but also his belief that the world could remain balanced. The idea that worthless people had destroyed what he loved most planted a bitter seed inside him. He tried to move on. He buried himself in work, calculations, and urban projects. But the silence at home was heavy. Jill withdrew, emotionally and then physically. John was left alone with his thoughts that slowly began to shift, like worn-out gears grinding until they found a new rhythm. He didn't notice it, but he was already breaking apart inside. Then came the second blow, the diagnosis: brain cancer, terminal, inoperable, the kind of sentence that transforms anyone. But in John, it changed more than just his routine. It broke the last barrier that kept him within the limits of normality. He, the man who always believed in control, was confronted with a cruel truth. He no longer had any, and that devastated him. From that moment on, John began observing everything with different eyes. He saw people wasting time, fighting over trivialities, complaining about small inconveniences. He, who had his days numbered, felt anger toward that collective apathy. To him, it was like watching someone voluntarily destroy their own life structure, something inconceivable to an engineer obsessed with purpose. That was when he tried to end it all. One final act of despair, a way to escape pain and helplessness. He got in his car, drove to the top of a hill, and accelerated toward the drop. But the vehicle didn't fall the way he expected. The metal structure bent in an unusual way, and John survived, broken, bleeding, but alive. Paradoxically alive for the first time. As he agonized among the wreckage, something occurred to him, not a mystical vision, but a cold, logical understanding. Surviving meant he had failed even at dying. And yet, something inside him ignited. He realized he only understood the value of life the moment he almost lost it. For John, that wasn't an accident. It was a test he believed he had passed. When he recovered, his outlook had changed. The broken man had become a determined one. He concluded that people didn't value life because they had never been truly confronted with death. For him, it was simple math. Extreme pressure generates extreme change. John Kramer, the engineer, began to design something new, something that combined pain, reflection, and survival. And thus, Jigsaw began to emerge. John spent months studying human behavior with the coldness of a scientist. He observed how people lied, cheated, wasted opportunities, and surrendered to their addictions while complaining about their own lives. He didn't feel empathy. He felt contempt. To him, they were defective structures that needed reinforcement or rupture. His mind was beginning to operate like a judgment machine. While medicine told him his days were numbered, John immersed himself in calculations. He designed mechanisms, tested forces, estimated the physical limits of the human body, not out of explicit cruelty, but out of logic. He wanted to create situations in which a person would confront their own worth. If they survived, they would be reborn. If not, they would become just another example of someone who didn't deserve what they had. The first targets weren't random. They were people John knew superficially: a repeat car thief, a violent man who beat his wife and laughed at the justice system, a drug addict who constantly took advantage of Jill. To John, they represented everything that had made his life miserable. He didn't see punishment. He saw correction. He saw necessary games. His first test wasn't an elaborate trap. It was almost improvised. John kidnapped the thief, took him to an empty warehouse and chained him up. He placed a rusty blade beside him and said, "Life has given you many chances. This is the last one." Then he calmly explained, to live, the man would need to sacrifice something. John watched, unmoved, as the victim's mind collapsed under pure fear. The thief survived, but emerged so traumatized that he never committed another crime. This outcome deeply affected John. There was no pleasure in witnessing suffering. There was satisfaction in witnessing transformation. That night he wrote, "Survival is true purification." This thought would become the heart of his philosophy, and the justification for all the horrors he would create later. From that moment on, John decided to refine his methods. He built mechanisms with the precision of a civil engineer and the coldness of a surgeon. He tested pulleys, locks, timers, and pressure systems. He left no flaws. His traps were not random, they were constructions. Structures where every force, every cut, every possibility had a purpose, calculated down to the millimeter. And while he built his world of trials, John also built a narrative. He didn't just want to test people physically, he wanted the victim to understand the reason. So he began recording messages, leaving raw, direct, almost didactic instructions. His voice was calm, nearly pedagogical. To him, it wasn't a kidnapping. It was a lesson, an intensive course on the value of life. Over time, John began to see his victims not as enemies, but as participants. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to prove they could save themselves. And if they failed, the blame was never his. It was theirs. He wholeheartedly believed in this logic. It was his moral shield, his personal ethical architecture. Every wasted life was a structure that deserved to be tested to the limit. It was during this period that the nickname Jigsaw began to emerge, not because he left puzzle pieces at the scenes, that would come later, but because police noticed the bodies showed precise cuts, as if parts were missing by choice. For John, removing a fragment from the victim symbolized the part of themselves they never valued. A reminder. A small but striking signature. John watched the news with scientific interest. He saw reports calling him a psychopath, a monster, a killer. None of it affected him. On the contrary, it reinforced his conviction that the world didn't understand the true message. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a reformer, an engineer not of buildings but of broken lives, and each new case brought him closer to his full evolution, becoming Jigsaw. With his methods becoming more refined, John decided to create a clear identity, not to become famous, but to be understood. He wanted each victim to know they were facing an idea, not just a man. That's when he began leaving the small puzzle piece cut from the flesh, a symbol. The missing piece represented the part of themselves the person never valued. At the same time, John designed increasingly complex mechanisms. He studied human limitations, ligament strength, asphyxiation time, pain tolerance. His calculations were as precise as those from his civil engineering days. The difference was that now the project wasn't a building, it was human behavior in its rawest, most desperate form. John also began studying body language, micro-expressions, and emotional triggers. He knew exactly how someone would react to panic, how they would try to deny reality, how they would beg for their own life. He observed everything with absurd coldness. Not for pleasure, but for analysis. To him, every expression was data, a living equation, an opportunity to improve his tests. His philosophy grew more rigid. He believed that true redemption only came when an individual confronted pain head-on. To live, one must sacrifice, he murmured as he adjusted chains and saws. What to anyone else would be brutality was, to John, simply extreme pedagogy. Each game was a mirror. Either the person faced their truth or died from avoiding it. The famous reverse bear trap emerged during this phase. One of the first iconic traps, it represented the raw terror John wanted to induce. The clear notion that if the participant didn't act immediately, they would be destroyed. The mechanism was designed as an emotional time bomb, not to kill for no reason, but to force the victim to act on a primal level, fighting for their own existence. A striking moment came when John realized some people simply didn't want to live. That realization affected him deeply. In his mind, the world was full of individuals so accustomed to suffering or guilt that they preferred giving up rather than fighting. To John, this was humanity's true disease, the inability to value their own breath until it was too late. During this period, his isolation grew. He no longer had friends, didn't seek out family, and made no attempt to contact Jill. He watched her from a distance but never approached. He knew his wife would never accept what he was becoming. Jill was compassion, reconstruction. He was now the opposite, punishment, confrontation, two worlds destined to drift apart forever. John also began documenting everything. He wrote obsessive journals filled with diagrams, philosophical reflections, and hypotheses about human behavior. Later, he began recording tapes for his victims. His calm, almost didactic voice would become his signature. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply explained step by step the logic of the test, like a teacher explaining a math problem. It was during this phase that Jigsaw ceased to be merely a police nickname and became his definitive identity. He no longer saw John Kramer and Jigsaw as different people. To him, they were two stages of the same evolution. John was the man of the past, limited, fragile, condemned. Jigsaw was the improved version, someone who had found purpose, clarity, and mission within pain. With his identity defined, philosophy structured, and methods precise, Jigsaw initiated the games that would mark the history of modern crime. He didn't hide out of fear. He hid out of strategy. His locations were carefully chosen: abandoned warehouses, decaying houses, decommissioned factories, places where the participant had nowhere to run, except inward into themselves. As his cancer progressed, John intensified his coldness. The closeness of death gave him absolute focus. He had no time for mistakes. Every trap needed to work with surgical precision. Every participant needed to have a real chance, minimal, brutal, but real. He rejected the label of killer. He insisted he never killed anyone. "I give them a choice," he repeated to himself like a mantra. It was during this phase that John began noticing patterns in the people he observed. Addictions, negligence, self-destruction, domestic violence, corruption. He believed the world was full of wasted lives, and in his mind, waste was worse than death. That's why he began selecting targets who embodied these human flaws, like an engineer deciding which beams must be reinforced or removed. John also began studying extreme psychological effects. He observed how fear altered decisions, how guilt distorted memories, how despair revealed hidden truths. To him, each participant was a living equation. His goal wasn't to punish them. It was to reveal who they truly were when everything was stripped away. No comfort, no excuses, no masks. It was during this period that Lawrence Gordon, a respected doctor, entered John's radar. He saw Gordon as someone wasting his life on affairs, quiet addictions, and arrogance. John believed Gordon needed a collapse to be reborn, so he designed one of his most emblematic games. An ordinary room transformed into a stage of extreme choices, where each passing second cost hope. But Jigsaw never worked only with violence. He deeply studied his victims before any game. He read about their lives, investigated their habits, understood their failures. His tests were built upon emotional diagnoses. He believed society failed either to judge or to save, so he assumed the role of moral architect, imposing radical corrections. It was during this phase that John encountered someone who would change the course of his games. Amanda Young, a drug addict, lost and self-destructive. To Jigsaw, Amanda was the perfect example of what he wanted to prove to the world. Someone who could be reborn by facing her own ruin. He put her in the reverse bear trap, a brutal test. But surviving it transformed her deeply. Amanda came out different. She didn't just survive, she understood what Jigsaw wanted to prove. To her, John wasn't a monster. He was a savior who forced her to see the value of her own existence. That made her his first disciple. Amanda began helping John with his setups, victim transport, and creation of scenarios. But there was a problem. She didn't follow the philosophy with the same precision. While John insisted he always gave a real chance, Amanda believed some people simply didn't deserve one. Her tests began to turn unjust, impossible to win. John noticed, but his body, weakened by cancer, limited his ability to control her. Her presence brought efficiency, but also deviation, a slow corruption of Jigsaw's original message. With Amanda at his side, the games became more frequent and more elaborate. Entire warehouses were turned into labyrinths. Machines and mechanisms grew increasingly sophisticated. John calculated every detail with the coldness of an engineer designing a building that must not fail. He knew his time was running out. He needed to leave something bigger than his dying body. And so, Jigsaw began building his legacy. Not just the games, but the philosophy behind them. He saw Amanda as his successor, even knowing she distorted some of his principles. John documented everything in videos, notebooks, and diagrams, so his methods would survive after his death. He didn't want to be remembered as a killer, but as someone who woke the world, even through horror. As his cancer advanced, John realized his death wouldn't be a distant event, but an inevitable step. He did not fear dying. He feared leaving his work incomplete. He began writing personal manifestos, explaining his philosophy in detail. Life only has value when confronted with death, he noted. These records would become guides for whoever inherited his methods. John also began preparing his final game, not for a specific victim, but for himself. He believed moral coherence required honesty. If he forced participants to face their pain, he too needed to confront his own mortality with clarity. He prepared an isolated room, arranged tools, and even planned how his death should be witnessed. As part of a cycle, Amanda, increasingly emotional and unstable, tried to prove she was ready to take over everything. But John saw in her the same fragility that marked so many of his victims: impulsiveness, resentment, premature judgment. He feared his successor would turn his teachings into pure vengeance. Still, he had no choice. His body weakened more each day. While John sought a way to solidify his legacy, another person entered the picture, Detective Hoffman. Unlike Amanda, Hoffman didn't find redemption through the games. He found opportunity. He saw in Jigsaw a powerful structure to eliminate his own enemies. He was efficient, cold, methodical, but driven by resentment, not philosophy. John realized this too late. In his final stretch, John knew he was surrounded by flawed apprentices: Amanda, emotionally unstable; Hoffman, motivated by his own agenda. He recorded everything in tapes and locked boxes. He intended that only those who truly understood his message would continue his tests. But that was his greatest mistake, believing anyone else could preserve such a distorted philosophy intact. When John prepared his last game, he didn't do it to punish, but to end his journey with coherence. He was captured by law enforcement and taken to an improvised room. There, weakened and bleeding, he remained calm. He explained his motives, his logic, his purpose. But no one understood him. To the world, he was just a killer. To himself, an unrecognized reformer. During the police operation, John tried to save Amanda from herself. He tried to show her that her rage was destroying the philosophy he wanted to leave behind. But it was too late. Amanda had already become a violent caricature of his teachings. The final tragedy began to unfold. The chosen successor had strayed, and the unchosen successor was about to take over everything. In the final confrontation, John was weak, struggling to breathe, but his mind remained sharp. He explained to the detective that everything had meaning, every game, every victim, every choice. But the world saw only a man dying slowly on a table. John Kramer took his last breath, aware that his philosophy would be interpreted and distorted by lesser minds. And so, John died, not as a cinematic monster, but as a human being who took an idea to its extreme. To him, his death wasn't defeat. It was structural closure, a final calculation reaching completion. As he lost his life, he believed his teachings would continue. Even if just one person truly understood his real purpose, to teach the value of life through suffering. After his death, the games continued, but never with the same logic. Amanda collapsed under her own demons. Hoffman turned everything into personal vengeance. The original philosophy fragmented. But in the silence of the tapes he left behind, John's voice echoes, calm, precise, unsettling. Jigsaw was not supernatural, not a creature. He was the truest kind of terror, an ordinary man with an unbreakable logic, mortal, absurd, and dangerously rational.